Clearly, there is a winner of the quarterback battle after the first 4 days of Tampa Bay Buccaneers training camp. That and more on today's episode of Locked On Bucs.
Your daily Tampa Bay Buccaneers podcast, part of the Locked On Podcast Network. Your team every day.
What's up, and welcome to this Monday episode of Locked On Bucs, your daily podcast covering the Tampa Bay Buccaneers, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. We want to thank you for making Locked On Bucs your first listen or view every single day. Don't forget you can subscribe or follow for free on YouTube and wherever you get your podcasts. And of course, you can follow us on Twitter. I am James Yarcho at JYarcho_Bucs. He is David Harrison at DHarrison82. We are your hosts of Locked On Bucs, credentialed members of the media covering your beloved Tampa Bay Buccaneers. I'm the deputy editor of SB Nation's BucsNation.com. David is a staff writer over at BucsGameDay.com, Sports Illustrated's Fan Nation site covering the Buccaneers. And we are here with you every Monday through Friday, along with our everydayers. And we want to share our appreciation for your continued support of the show.
And on today's episode of Locked On Bucs, we're going to discuss the latest Buccaneers player to hit the NFL Top 100, a scary moment that happened at Bucs training camp on Sunday, and what that could mean moving forward. But we're going to start today by talking about the fact that nobody individually, no quarterback, is clearly winning the Buccaneers quarterback battle, but that's actually a really big win for the Tampa Bay Buccaneers themselves, and clearly the Buccaneers are the winners of this quarterback battle after 4 training camp practices, the fourth one wrapping up on Sunday. And James, through 4 practices, here are some highlights, a couple of lowlights from what Baker Mayfield has done, the long presumed starting quarterback of the Tampa Bay Buccaneers, not just by us, but by a lot of people. Day 1, there was a 30-yard pass to tight end Cade Otton. Of course, that helped inspire my solo episode that was very Cade Otton heavy, which I'm sure that you appreciated, as you did not have to be the one praising the Cade Otton on that episode, and you let me do that. For day 2, few more highlights, 40-yard pass to Raheem Jarrett, who's been having a very solid training camp so far, a 50-yard touchdown pass to Chris Godwin, but then there was the Nolan Turner interception. There was another touchdown pass to Mike Evans during that practice, and then there was a touchdown pass to end the 2-minute drill for the first-team offense, or actually I think it was the second-team offense. Baker and Kyle they've been flip-flopping, so I don't know exactly which team offense, but Barber, you figure probably second team, right? Day 3, another touchdown pass to Mike Evans in the red zone. A little bit of caveat to that one, though. If there was contact and if the Buccaneers didn't care about the other Buccaneers, Mike Evans would have been drilled on that pass. So, it's a touchdown, but not the greatest ball placement by Baker Mayfield there. Keith caught a touchdown from Baker on day 3, as did Chris Godwin, and as did David Wells, the backup tight end. A 50-yard drive in 11-on-11s was capped off by that touchdown pass. That was a really nice drive, according to Logan Thomas of BucsGameDay.com. who has been Logan Robinson of BucsGameDay.com. Logan Thomas is a Washington Commanders tight end. Anyway, day 4, there's a 20-plus yard pass to Cade Warner, a 50-yard touchdown pass to Chris Godwin, but then another interception, this time Servassier Dennis, victimizing Baker Mayfield.
Yeah, and then on the flip side, and I know why we did it this way, it's so that maybe our Gator fan listeners will begin to forgive me for the things that I've said about Kyle Trask, because I'm going to talk about all the great things that he has done. Day 1, beautiful thread the needle kind of pass over the middle to Chris Godwin. Day 2, he had a 3-and-out on his first set of 11-on-11s, but then he throws a touchdown pass in the red zone to Miller. He was also intercepted by Servassier Dennis. Servassier Dennis has been tearing it up. We'll talk about that later. And then pass to Godwin, and then Cade Otton to the 15-yard line. Day 3, nice, really impressive rollout completion to Raheem Jarrett along the sideline. He had a touchdown pass to Daphne. He had a touchdown pass to Chris Godwin. He led a 50-yard drive in 11-on-11s, capped off by another touchdown to Miller. And then on day 4, all the touchdowns by Kyle Trask. He had 4 of them to Moore, Wells, Otton, and of course, Big Mike Evans, who apparently made a highlight reel level catch on that one. So David, you and we've talked about the competition. We've also talked about our belief that the moment that Baker was signed, it was his competition to lose. They didn't sign him to be a backup. They signed him to be the starting quarterback. Kyle Trask is not going away quietly in all of this.
No, he's not. And I think he deserves some credit for that because I'll be honest, like if we were stat scouting at this point in time, I think Baker's got 8 or 9 touchdown passes, but Kyle's got 7 or 8 touchdown passes himself. They both have two interceptions thrown in the first 4 days. I would not expect it stat wise to actually be that close. So if you're just looking at the stat box, I mean, they're neck and neck, you know what I mean? And they're throwing touchdowns to the starters. They're throwing touchdowns to the depth guys. I mean, they're throwing touchdowns to receivers and potential tight ends that may not even be on this active roster by the time the regular season comes. So I think it's certainly time for us specifically. I think there's a lot of people out there, but I'm not going to worry about them. I'm just going to worry about us. We need to go ahead and acknowledge that Kyle Trask is making this a fight, and he's applying some pressure to Baker Mayfield for doing it. Because as much as Baker wants to talk about, like I know he says he's been off social media for 2 years and all those things. Listen, you don't have to open your Twitter app to know what's being said on Twitter, and you don't have to go on Instagram to know what's being said on Instagram, right? So Baker knows what the words are, and I applaud him for trying to ignore that noise because that's only going to weaken you. It's not going to strengthen you, right? But I think it's really good to see these quarterbacks pushing each other, and I think it gives the Buccaneers some confidence moving forward that either quarterback right now, and again, things could incredibly change over the next 5 or 6 weeks, but for right now, we're just talking about after day 4. Both of these guys are looking good in the early going. I do think that there will come some separation, and talking to Logan Robinson and Dustin Lewis, who have been on ground there for Bucs game day in Tampa, I will tell you this, that Baker Mayfield, according to their eyes, Baker Mayfield's deep ball does look significantly better than Kyle Trask. That's where Kyle is struggling right now, is with the deep ball. I think most of us kind of expected that. But once you kind of get into the crunch zone, the red zone, even inside the opponent 35, stuff like that, that's when it really kind of starts to even out. And that's where you see Kyle Trask really kind of making his mark and keeping this competition interesting. So if that deep ball stays the way it is right now, where Baker's deep ball looks a lot better than Kyle Trask, then I think that's where we're going to see the separation, because even if you're going to be a grinded out offense, 5 to 10 yards here and there, you still want the ability to throw the ball deep and challenge defenses deep, because if you don't, by week 6, 7, 8, you're just going to see stacked boxes and people are going to play within 10, 15 yards of the line of scrimmage, and that's not going to be good for your offense. So I do still think that Baker is winning, but not by the margin that I honestly expected by the end of week 1. We're not completely to the end of week 1, but I expected by the end of week 1 that there would be a bigger margin than this.
Yeah, I'm with you 100%. And, honestly, that's making this training camp all the more interesting, because like you, I figured by the end of that first week, Baker would have this well in hand. Kyle is fighting tooth and nail. This is going to be a 15 round, slugfest. And again, kudos to Kyle. He's making me eat some of my words. I'm not going to eat all of them quite yet, but I am having to ease off, because you and I have watched him in training camp. I've watched him in all of his NFL training camps thus far, and he has not been overly impressive in those. But we've also talked about how he's kind of a slow developer. It's a gradual incline for him, and it looks like he's starting to hit his stride in the NFL game here, and making this competition truly one that is legitimate. I do want to make one quick note away from the quarterbacks, if that's okay with you. An update on the other big position battle, of course, between the kickers. So on Sunday, Chase McLaughlin won that competition against Blankenship. And the only reason I want to bring this up, David, is because you and I talked about the competition, I believe it was last week. Yep. And we talked about how McLaughlin kind of struggles from, the further back he goes, almost along the same lines as Suckup. Dude buried a 58-yarder in practice on Sunday. Blankenship missed his long distance one. So that one is also kind of even through the first 4 days as well.
Yeah, absolutely. I hope they get into the stadium and kick. I know there was a couple training camps, a few years back where they did that, and I hope they do that this year, because I think that's, making kicks on the practice field is great, but let's get into Ray J. The conditions are a little bit different. Let's see what you can do there, and obviously they're going to do that during the games as well. But I would like to see some, or hear about some practices happening there. So we'll see what happens with the quarterback battles. We'll continue to move forward. We'll obviously see what happens with the kicker battle. I'm still glasses gang all the way. But what we might not see for a little bit is first-round pick defensive lineman Calijah Kancey. That's coming up next on today's episode of Locked On Bucs, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. And that conversation is going to be brought to you by our friends over at FanDuel. Take your first swing at betting Major League Baseball on FanDuel and get 10 times your first bet amount and bonus bets up to $200. That's right. If you just bet $20, you'll land $200 in bonus bets, whether you win or lose. This is not a lose-only stipulation. You bet $20 on the Tampa Bay Rays to whoop up on the Washington Nationals if they ever play again or when they play again. I don't know their schedule off the top of my head. You will probably win that bet, and you'll still get $200 in bonus bets. That's $200 you can then spend on everything from the money line to the over-under to who you think is going to hit the first home run, all on an app that's safe, secure, and super easy to use. Plus, when you win, you can get paid instantly. So sign up today and visit FanDuel.com/lockedon to get up to $200 in bonus bets. That's FanDuel.com/lockedon. FanDuel, official partner of Major League Baseball. Continuing, I can't talk for some reason. Right when I start, I just step on myself. Continuing today's conversation here on the Locked On Bucs podcast, David Harrison and James Yarcho talking Buccaneers training camp because, of course, we are. 4 days are in. A lot more days are to come. Every dayers. We appreciate you being here for all 4 days of training camp coverage. We appreciate you coming back for the rest of training camp coverage as well. What we don't appreciate is seeing Calijah Kancey carted off the field with a calf injury on Sunday. Here is a quick video for those who haven't. It's not the Ryan Jensen video, so we feel a little bit more comfortable sharing this. But video courtesy of Dustin Lewis of BucsGameDay.com and Buccaneers PR staff did give permission to Bucs Game Day staff to air the video. So here it is if you haven't seen it. All right. So for those of you on YouTube, obviously you just saw it. For those of you on audio, you can't see it. And if you want to go on Twitter, if you want to go on YouTube and watch the video on this episode, you can freely do that. But it looks fairly simple, James. I mean, he comes off the line. It's an individual drill, so it's not necessarily full speed, but he goes around one of the tackling dummies, kind of makes a move to rip past a simulated offensive lineman, comes around, and then as he's getting to the second tackling dummy, just kind of pulls up and hobbles off the side of the field, and you see him, immediately start rubbing that right calf there. And look, Calijah Kancey is not me, and he's in much, much better shape. And what I'm about to tell you is going to prove that. It kind of reminds me, every once in a while, my left calf, I'll be sleeping, and I will be woken up by a massive, I'm going to call it cramp, but you could classify it as a strain potentially in my left calf. I've actually had it MRI'd because of this reoccurring thing that happens. I mean, it happens fairly often. And I mean, and just the motion that Calijah was having there, it just brings me back to when I go through that. Of course, I'm sleeping when this happens. Calijah Kancey is an NFL lineman doing NFL things. So that shows you the difference in athletic ability there between myself and young Calijah Kancey. But the reason I tell you that story is because for the next 24 hours, whenever this happens, I'm limping. Like I limp for the next 24 hours after that happens all the time. And even that for the next 2 or 3 days, it's sore. So, it's something that's extremely painful. And again, that's not the same level, but to the extent that I can sympathize with Calijah, that's the closest I can get because I've never had something like that happen. But then it also reminded me, James, of something that happened in your neck of the woods. And I don't know how much you're paying attention to it these days, but Joe Burrow just suffered what they're calling a calf strain during Cincinnati Bengals practice and had to be carted off the field. So what do you see when you see that video? And what, if anything, do you draw parallels from Joe Burrow's situation?
Yeah, I mean, it looked eerily similar to what Joe Burrow just went through. And Burrow is expected to be out for a couple of weeks. He might be ready for week 1, but I think that's also the difference between not wanting to put him out there too soon. And I will say this, because I think this is going to play a big part in what happened, because you brought up the calf cramp as you phrased it. The heat in Tampa is brutal. Like most of our listeners know that. The majority of our listeners are in the Florida area, are in Tampa, but it's brutal. And I will say, when Joe Burrow went down, the heat in Ohio at that point in time was absolutely brutal. It was up over 105 with the heat index. So I think the hydration played a part in both. I'm no doctor. This is just kind of what I'm guessing. And I do think that it ended up being similar to those cramps that caused a strain. Like, quite simply, these guys are they think they're hydrated enough. Most of them are hydrated enough, but when you think you are, you still need more hydration, because this stuff is going to happen more and more and more. And that's when we've seen these soft tissue issues with some of the Buccaneers over the course of the last couple of years. So you want Calijah Kancey to be back, as soon as possible, but you don't want to rush him back. And he's been getting a lot of buzz. Even Sunday morning before the injury happened, there were multiple videos of what Calijah Kancey was doing, and people talking about, look how quick he is. Look how fast his get off is. This guy is going to really impact some games. And then boom, he's down with that calf injury. So you want to make sure that it's back all the way before you send him out there and create bigger problems than what he already has. But I'm really, really disappointed that this could delay the development that we saw. So instead of being a week 1 impact guy, maybe we're looking at week 4, week 5 before he's truly at his, at the level that he seemed to be progressing to.
Yeah. So looking at bostonbodyworker.com, which is a site about body wellness and taking care of your body. Basically, they define the difference between a cramp and a strain. So it's the same activity, like your muscle seizes the same way, but a cramp is relatively short. So that's what I experience, because it goes away after about 30 seconds or so. And I sit there and I massage it out, and it goes away after about 30 seconds or so, whereas a strain lasts much longer. So that would be the difference. So essentially, that's what Calijah Kancey is dealing with. And then, like you said, I mean, if Joe Burrow, his head coach said that they do expect him to be ready for week 1 of the regular season. Well, that typically hints that you're not going to see him in the preseason. And I would say if Calijah Kancey is going to go through the same situation, how significant is it to his impact and his development as a rookie, as a first-year defensive lineman? I think it is significant. I don't think it's disastrous. I don't think it's Titanic time, right? It's not, time to completely hit the panic button. But you want to get as much NFL conditioning as you possibly can, especially with the pads coming on next week. Like, this is an opportunity to go up against, I don't know about the Ryan Jensens. I don't know what the Buccaneers plan on with, pad week and all that stuff coming up, but you're getting to go up against NFL offensive linemen. And look, no offense to, the other players in the ACC that Calijah went up against at Pitt, but, Syracuse, I mean, they had a couple of good offensive linemen in the NFL draft this year, but for the most part, most of those teams, 3/5, 4/5 of your offensive line not going to the National Football League. So this is your first time to get NFL offensive line experience, and I think it's important and valuable. So if Calijah misses the entire preseason, I still think the Buccaneers should err on the side of caution, like you said. Make sure he's fully healthy before you go rushing him back on the field. So if he's got to miss the entire preseason, so be it. I would rather have that than have him come back early and get aggravated or an even worse injury, something like that. But let's make no mistake about it. Missing your entire training camp. And yeah, this is just potentially, right? So none of this has been said by the Buccaneers staff. We're just drawing parallels from the Joe Burrow situation. No injury is the exact same. So don't take this as a report that Calijah is going to miss it, but the potential is there. And I do think it's worth noting that is something that certainly could be impactful. So James, next man up. So, the team, so obviously we got Vita, right? We got Logan Hall on one side we expect to be a starter, but you also have Greg Gaines that came in as a free agent, but we also have Will Golston that came back. So what's the front three look like to you, do you think, if Calijah Kancey can't go during this preseason?
I'm going to completely take a cop out on this answer, but I think it's a combination of the two. Like, I really, truly do. You brought in Greg Gaines for a reason, right? You brought him in specifically to help this defensive line. You signed Golston last week. So obviously they know that they're going to get an impact out of Greg Gaines, but then we also know that Gaines is going to get time when Vita needs a breather. So there's absolutely going to be situations where you got Logan Hall, Vita Vea, and Greg Gaines lined up, but then maybe Vita needs a breath. He's off the field. Gaines slides over. Now you got William Golston coming in. But I would say, when you have Vita on the field, it's going to be probably pretty close to a 50-50 split between Golston and Gaines, depending on the situation. I would think that Golston would be on the field more for run situations, whereas they're probably going to bring Gaines out for third down and have him be part of that frontline pass rush. But I don't see either one of them really asserting themselves as the full replacement for Kancey while, for however long he's out. It's going to have to be a collective between the two.
Yeah, so I think the opposite. I think it's great. I think it's William Golston. I think Golston steps up to be the Calijah Kancey on the defensive line. I think Gaines, his primary role is as kind of the second nose tackle on the defense, is pretty much solidified. But those special packages, like you mentioned, and that's where you might see they might go to those special packages where Greg Gaines and Vita are on the field together. Like that, I think you could see happen more often as an effect of this. So could Gaines get more reps? Yes, absolutely. But I think if you're looking at who replaced Calijah, I think it's going to be Will Golston. So we'll see how the Buccaneers react to this. Of course, more information will come as the Bucs work through this, as the MRI results come in and all that stuff. And of course, it's preseason, so they don't actually have to tell you a whole lot, and they don't like to tell you a whole lot. So we'll see how much we hear, and we'll see how much we see on the ground in Tampa, Florida, as training camp continues. But we know we're going to see Mike Evans on the NFL Top 100 because that part of the list is already out. Who else from the Buccaneers roster could make the NFL Top 100? We're going to discuss that next on today's episode of Locked On Bucs.
Wrapping things up here on a Monday edition of the Locked On Bucs podcast, and we're talking the NFL Top 100. You know, that list where Tristan Wirfs was in the 90s, and somehow Jared Goff was like 62nd. Jared Goff ahead of Tristan Wirfs. That's a thing that happened. But something else that happened was that Mike Evans came in at number 53 for the second year in a row. Same spot, 53rd. Okay, fine, whatever. It shows that the other NFL players are giving him a little bit more respect than maybe the national media or, I don't know, the Madden evaluators do. And some receivers that were ranked below, well, not some, all of the receivers that were ranked below Mike Evans were Amon-Ra St. Brown at 67, Deebo Samuel at 61, Garrett Wilson at 74, DeAndre Hopkins at 90, Terry McLaurin at 94, and Devontae Smith at 100. Going to, I will use this, even though we've spent a lot of time, David, bashing this list. I am now going to use this list as an excuse to claim victory over an argument that you and I have had going back to our walking the plank days when you kept telling me DeAndre Hopkins was better than Mike Evans. And I said, no, sir. Mike Evans is the superior.
Okay. First of all, no, listen to me. First of all, back then, DeAndre Hopkins was absolutely the best wide receiver in the National Football League. You can't then say, well, let me wait 5 years until DeAndre Hopkins is older and starting to get to the end of his tenure. And now all of a sudden, because if we're going to use that logic, I'm going to tell you Terry McLaurin's better than Jerry Rice, because Jerry Rice ain't running routes, bro. So that's not the case. Today's world, yes, Mike Evans is absolutely better than DeAndre Hopkins. Actually, I'm going to use DeAndre Hopkins as part of my argument point moving forward. But just before you finish that heresy, I wanted to cut you off because, no, back then when I made that argument, DeAndre Hopkins was the best receiver in the league, which, of course, makes him better than Mike Evans. And that's not shade to Mike. That's just how good DeAndre was.
No, DeAndre was fantastic. I just, that argument popped up in my brain as I was reading this list. And I'm like, you know what? We're going to make a callback. Our everydayers might remember those days.
Here's what this reminds me of, and there's no NBA team in Tampa, so I can talk about this. But back when Carmelo Anthony got traded to the New York Knicks, every year for like 3 years, it was like, who won the trade? The Knicks or the Nuggets? The Knicks or the Nuggets? It's like both teams are doing nothing. So neither team won the trade. Well, there's a Nuggets fan that I know, and I'm not going to out him because he's a friend of mine, but there's a Nuggets fan that I know that went, well, guess the Nuggets won the Carmelo trade because they won a championship before the Knicks did. I was like, bro, that was 20 years ago.
Right.
Like, could you draw some lines like, like all the subsequent moves? Okay, got it. But no, that's way too far of a separation. So anyway, get out of here with that mess. I will tell you this. You kind of touched on this. So the fact that Mike Evans is number 53 again does show that the league didn't necessarily take his production and say, well, that's Tom Brady. While Tristan Wirfs didn't necessarily get the same benefit of the doubt, or Tristan Wirfs was more heavily penalized for his unit's struggles last season, Mike Evans does seem to at least have the respect of his peers to a certain extent. I think the lack of what you would call desirable explosiveness, and we'll talk about that here in a minute as well, is what's kind of holding Mike Evans back. But when you talk about being a steady playmaker for his team with the ability to work, honestly, I would say 2 of the 4 areas of the field, like I don't want to see Mike Evans on an end around. You know what I mean? I just don't want to see that happen. And even Mike Evans on a screen, like all the blocks got to be there. You know what I mean? If the blocks aren't there, it's just not going to happen. So you really do have a receiver that can work to the intermediate and the deep parts of the field. But it shows that they have that level of respect for him. However, it doesn't mean, James, that respect runs the full course, because there are certainly going to be receivers ranked ahead of Mike Evans that should not be. Let's go one for one here, but give me your first receiver that you think, and it doesn't have to be a particular order, but the first guy on your list that you think is going to come in ahead of Mike that shouldn't be ahead of Mike.
To me, it's going to be CeeDee Lamb. I think we're going to see CeeDee pop up on this list. And the biggest thing about that is the fact that he's a Cowboy. I don't think he's a better receiver than Mike Evans. I don't think that I don't want to say that he doesn't provide the threat that Mike does, because he's a good receiver, but I wouldn't take him over Mike Evans on Sundays. I just personally
wouldn't take him over Chris Godwin either.
I wouldn't take and I mean, there's players that have already been listed that I wouldn't take over Chris Godwin, and obviously Godwin's not going to make the list, but CeeDee Lamb to me is not the complete receiver that Mike Evans is, and because he's got a star on his helmet and he's marketable, he's going to end up ahead of Evans on this list.
Yeah, so the first thing that came to my mind was Cooper Kupp. You know what I mean? And I like Cooper, don't get me wrong. I think he certainly has a skill set that can be used by NFL teams, but he's not an every year 1,000-yard receiver. And I know there's been some injuries involved, and that's not something you should necessarily punish a guy for. But I think what you see with the Los Angeles Rams and Cooper Kupp specifically is when that offense struggles, the entire offense struggles. And I'm always going to lean back to Mike Evans. And this dude did this playing with Ryan Fitzpatrick and suspended Jameis Winston. Mike Glennon threw passes to Mike Evans for his 1,000-yard season. So when you have a receiver in Mike Evans' caliber who is producing despite subpar quarterback play, when you come at me and tell me that the guy's starting quarterback was injured for part over a lot of the season, you lose my sympathy. So Cooper Kupp for that period, I think he's very good at what he does, but I think what he does is very limited. And that's not the same for my second guy. But I think, honestly, this guy is very talented in his own rights. One of my favorite receivers in the NFL. But I think when you have to say if you want one primary receiver that you think could take over a game, who is it going to be? I take Mike Evans over Stephon Diggs. But I think Stephon Diggs gets a little bit more praise because he's a little bit more of your traditional receiver, whereas he's a little bit more boisterous. He's a little bit more of a showboater, which is very entertaining, and I enjoy watching him play. But I think if you're looking for the consistent producer and the guy who, when your team is down, is going to help pick your team up, I want Mike Evans over Stephon Diggs. So it goes a little bit past the X's and O's, talking a little bit of a leadership. We're talking about a little bit of mental fortitude. I take Mike over Stephon because of those differentiating factors.
Yeah, and those are some of the reasons that I put my next guy on the list. He's the lesser of the two 13s, and that is, of course, Los Angeles Charger Keenan Allen. And this guy loves to, pop off at the mouth and talk about how great he is and say, you better start me in your fantasy lineups, and I'm going to go off. And then he has 2 catches for 4 yards. He's not the guy that's going to rally the team around him. He's not the guy that's going to put the team on his back. He's not the guy that's going to win the jump ball one-on-ones basically every single time. They're starting to look more to Mike Williams for that kind of stuff. So Keenan Allen is somehow, some way going to end up popping up on this list ahead of Mike Evans. And that might be the residual effect of how good and how captivating Justin Herbert is as the quarterback. And, Mike's not getting that love because it's Baker or Kyle. But as we've talked about numerous times on the show, it doesn't matter if it's Baker or Kyle or Jameis or Ryan or Mike or Tom Brady. Evans is going to be Evans. So, I would take him over Keenan Allen 1,000% of the time. And then this last one for me is DK Metcalf. And we know DK Metcalf is an athletic freak. We know he is a physical specimen, but he's also, again, not the consistent guy that Mike is year in, year out, game out. He's not that dude. In fact, Tyler Lockett is the more reliable of the Seahawks receivers, and he doesn't get any love. Tyler Lockett should be on this list ahead of a couple of these other guys, and he's not going to get that love. But DK will, because, again, he's a big-time superstar. He's fun to watch. He makes incredible highlight reel plays, but he's not Mike.
Yeah. My final receiver on the list, I think, is going to get ranked above Mike on the top 100. That probably shouldn't be. Is going to be Dolphins receiver Jalen Waddle. And Again, this is not a diss on Jalen Waddle, so to speak, but it's interesting because when you look at the rankings, there is no single criteria for these rankings, right? Like players aren't told only use last year to predict this year, only use the embodiment of work to predict what's going to happen this next year. Because if it was judging last year on this year, DeAndre Hopkins wouldn't even be on this list. And I'm a big fan of DeAndre Hopkins, but let's be honest, like the dude didn't even sign with the team until right before training camp. All these other things are happening around him where his production is low, and it's not completely his fault. But if we're using just last year, there's no way DeAndre Hopkins is even on this list. If we're using the whole body of work, okay, putting D-Hop ahead of guys like Terry McLaurin, Devontae Smith, certainly. But Jalen Waddle, good young receiver, certainly on the path to become one of the better young receivers in the NFL once he hits his kind of veteran stride. But let's be honest, he didn't become a big threat in the National Football League until he had Tyreek Hill lining up on the other side of the field. And we all know Tyreek Hill, if he's not the number one receiver on this list, he's going to be number 2, maybe number 3 at worst. And when you have that guy on the other side of the field and you look at the criteria people are ranking on, I'm sorry, but you have to get knocked down just a little bit. I don't believe that the Dolphins have 2 receivers that are singularly better than Mike Evans is as a primary receiver for the Buccaneers. I think if you are taking the entire body of work together, then potentially you could say that duo is better right now than Chris Godwin and Mike Evans, mainly because Chris is still coming back from that injury. I think this year that could change as well, but I wouldn't blame people if they were saying that duo is better than the Buccaneers duo just because of recent history. Then I also look at a guy like Amon-Ra St. Brown, who's number 67 after 1 year of very good production, but it's 1 year. So you got D-Hop, the legacy, Amon-Ra St. Brown, the new guy, which means the criteria for evaluation is not the same across the board. So I'm going to go ahead and say that Jalen Waddle's getting his flowers a little too early over a guy like Mike Evans.
Yeah, and I would 100% agree with you. That was one of the names on my list. And just for the record, some names that are going to be placed above Mike Evans that I'm not really going to argue with too much, in my opinion: Justin Jefferson, Jamar Chase, Tyreek Hill, A.J. Brown, Devontae Adams. Those guys are going to be on there. So I don't think all 6 of ours are going to pop up on there, but I would say at least 4 of these 6 are going to be on this list ahead of Mike and shouldn't be. But with that, we are going to bid you all a fair adieu. Make sure you are coming back tomorrow. We are going to have more training camp talk coming at you.
We're talking about practice.
And the Bucs are going to be in full pads on Monday. So it'll be interesting to see if, I don't know, any fights break out like they did in Cleveland over the weekend. But we will be back with that for you. If you have any thoughts, ideas, reactions, anything at all, make sure that you email them to lockedonbuckspodcast@gmail.com or drop them here in the YouTube comments and we will bring them up on the show. We want to thank you for making Locked On Bucs your first listen review every single day, for making us part of your day, part of your routine. And of course, if there's anything else you would like to discuss, you can find us on Twitter at @JYarcho_Bucs, at DHarrison82, and the show at Locked On Bucs. Hope you all have an absolutely outstanding day. Stay safe, stay healthy, fire the cannons. We thank you so much for joining us right here on Locked On Bucs, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.